Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Friday, April 22nd. And what we've been seeing and hearing today has got us talking tonight. We're seeing new satellite images in a part of Ukraine that Russia is fighting to control. Those pictures appear to be a mass grave. A Ukrainian journalist tells us where she thinks this war is heading. Then, what we're hearing, new audio files of Congressman Kevin McCarthy. They contradict what the Republican leader has said about former President Trump and January 6th. What will that mean for his political future? And it's Earth Day. We'll show you a new technology that converts carbon emissions using, of all things, concrete. We are getting more stories of possible war crimes against civilians in Ukraine, and not just stories, but satellite images. Check out these recent pictures. They appear to show mass graves about 12 miles from Mariupol. Now, we cannot verify them from the ground, but Ukrainian officials say the graves could hold as many as 9,000 bodies. Mariupol's mayor compared it to a historic ravine in Kyiv called Babi Yar. That is where Nazis killed more than 30,000 Jews during World War II. Russian troops have been hammering Mariupol, so its mayor says the death toll there could rival Babi Yar. Today, Russia's military said that it wants control of Ukraine's entire southern coast. Mariupol is one of its main port cities. You see it there on the Sea of Azov. Now, many analysts are skeptical of this claim because it came from a little-known Russian general, and big policy shifts like that typically come from higher up the chain of command. Ukrainian officials say that Russia has taken control of some small villages in recent days, but Ukrainian and Western officials say that Russia has yet to make significant gains in this new phase of the war. Meanwhile, Russian media says President Vladimir Putin will meet with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and his office says that he will indeed travel to Moscow early next week. Let's begin with NBC's Ali Arouzi joining us from Lviv in Ukraine. And Ali, what do we know about these reported mass graves in Mariupol?
Hi, Joshua. That's right. Well, those satellite imagery has shown those mass graves about 12 miles west of Mariupol in a town called Manhush. And those graves have been expanding over the last several weeks to just show the scale of how many people they are putting in there. Now, they are adjacent to an existing cemetery, and the mayor of Mariupol says that, the Russians have been dumping bodies in there over the last several weeks. He says that as many as 9,000 civilians have been put in those graves. And look, the Ukrainian authorities, the mayor of Mariupol has been saying for a while now that up to 20,000 people may have died in Mariupol. So the scale of the atrocity there is going to be greater than anything else we've seen in Ukraine. It's going to be much bigger than those atrocities than we've seen in Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel. And as you mentioned earlier, the Ukrainians are making comparisons to Babi Yar, where up to over 30,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered by the Nazis there in 1941. The mayor of Mariupol saying that this is the greatest atrocity of the 21st century. So what's going to come out of Mariupol is going to be horrifying, but of course nobody has had any access to Mariupol. The Russians have hemmed that place off. So if it does open up, it's going to be pretty horrifying by all accounts.
What about Russia's purported strategy in the east and south of Ukraine? Do we know whether or not the sort of gains that they've been making in that area would lend credence to the possibility of them creating that kind of east-to-south land bridge?
Well, that certainly seems to be their objective. Look, the Donbass, Donetsk, Luhansk region, they've made no qualms about saying that they want those areas. That has been clearly part of their focus. They want to connect that to Crimea, to create a land bridge between Donbass and Crimea, and then connect it to the Russian mainland. And look, the Russian Defense Ministry also laid out its plans today for what they call the second phase of this war, and that is taking Donbass. That is creating creating that land bridge that is destroying any connections the Ukrainians have to their own ports on the Black Sea, and then taking control of the southern part of Ukraine, and then creating another corridor to Moldova, to a place called Transnistria, which has Russian separatists in it. And if they do manage to get to Transnistria, that's a very vulnerable place. It really doesn't have a functioning army. It has Russian separatists. It's been called a mini Donbass. It's not a member of NATO or the EU, so it's not going to be very hard for them to take it if they get there, but they have to break through Odessa first. And the Ukrainians have heavily fortified Odessa, but as we've seen time and time again, the Russians have no fear of destroying an entire city to gain battlefield momentum and then reach their objective. So that's going to be an area where they're going to try and hurt the Ukrainians again, possibly in the coming days and weeks.
Now, the UK says it's considering sending tanks to Poland, and President Zelensky thanked the UK in his nightly address. I can read the translation. We don't have it subtitled on the screen, but he said, and I'm quoting from our interpretation of what he said, quote, "I'm grateful to our British friends for their important symbolic decision that was announced today, the return of the embassy to Kyiv. The United Kingdom became the 21st country that is returning the diplomatic representatives to our capital, and it signals that not only we alone believe in the victory of life over death." Returning the embassy to Kyiv, Ali, would be a big step in this war. I know that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, didn't answer questions today about whether the U.S. would move the American embassy to Kyiv. What does all that represent in terms of this war? Is it symbolic or is it bigger than that?
It is bigger than symbolism. It shows solidarity with the Ukrainian people. It shows that they're not afraid to be in Kyiv, even if the Russian focus then goes back to Kyiv. And look, the British have opened up their embassy there. The Ukrainians were very grateful for that. But there is a debate going on in the United States as whether they should, and whether it's safe to. But the Ukrainians very much want that. And another thing I've got to mention to you, Joshua, is the Ukrainians are very grateful for all the help they've got from the United States, but they'd also like a visit from a high-level U.S. dignitary here. We've seen Boris Johnson, high-level Europeans come here, but they would really like an American to come here and show support for Ukraine, because that would send a very strong message to Russia that not only would the United States be willing to reopen its embassy in Kyiv, but would send the Secretary of State, or the Defense Secretary at least, to Ukraine as a show of force and solidarity with this country.
Thank you, Ali. Safe travels as always. That's NBC's Ali Arouzi starting us off tonight from Lviv, Ukraine. Last week, you may remember at this time, we were putting your questions to Ali about what it's been like covering this war. But consider what it would be like to cover it as a Ukrainian. The work of Ukrainian journalists is hard enough during this invasion, but the challenges they face are bigger than their personal safety. It's hard to share the truth with so many people pushing lies. Joining us now is Veronika Melkozarova, the executive editor of The New Voice of Ukraine. That's an English language news site based in Kyiv, and she also freelances for NBC News. Ms. Melkozarova, welcome to the program. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just give us the general picture right now of how you and your staff are doing under all these circumstances? How are y'all holding up?
We're doing fine. We're constantly working and trying to keep up despite numerous hacking attacks on our website. And also, we hadn't had any days off in 2 months. But the whole country is living like that right now. So this is how we're doing.
Talk about the hacks on your website. What's been going on with that?
We recently got the message from one of our readers who said that in this special forums of Russian cyber armies, they are discussing like our website would be a next target, and yes, they are constantly trying to hack our website, but for now we're safe because of our good IT guys. However, this makes the work harder, even harder.
How much has that been affecting news sites in Ukraine? I would imagine quite a bit, either taking the sites down or maybe changing the content on the sites to make it look like the news is not what it actually is. Is that something that's been happening a lot lately?
Yeah, it's been happening a lot. For example, just today there were news that this live of our TV channel, one of top TV channels in Ukraine was hacked, and the hackers, they put this running text like live on Ukrainian TV saying that our president was murdered and we have to lay our weapons and surrender. So this is how our life has changed.
That's pretty wild that they're able to hack into the television station and put lies on television. How are people responding to all of that? I hope people are able to use a little common sense and question when they see things like that.
Of course, messages like that are mostly aimed to just scare people. I don't think that anyone would believe such information from the Ukrainian TV channel, especially they signed this message by saying glory to Russia. So this was clearly done just like a hooliganism or something like that, just to annoy people, just to scare people and intimidate people. So yeah, our people, they know where to find information about our president. He's like constantly making video addresses every day, maybe even several times a day. So yeah, he's protected well, and this message was just a prank.
So in light of pranks like this and all these hacks that news websites are facing, I wonder what it means for you these days to be a journalist, a Ukrainian journalist in the middle of this war. What does this work mean to you these days?
This means a lot, because I think that information matters, and the fact that we're able to tell the world about our country in English so that many people could understand, and that we're able to fight Russian propaganda in the West that has like a lot of millions of dollars in it, like Russia Today, for example. This is the government-financed Russian TV channel that has like budgets we can only dream about. And those people, they are like messing people's minds, not only about Ukraine, but also about their own countries. And all we can do is to fight with them, presenting facts. Sometimes, yes, of course, facts are boring because it's truth, while propaganda is like very sophisticated. Sometimes it's stupid but really aggressive, and that makes it entertaining. So people just like they fall for it just because it's entertaining, and then we come and we try to debunk it. So it's basically action and reaction, I would say. And I think that many Ukrainian journalists, they started speaking and writing English, and that helped to tell the world more about Ukraine. And I see a different reaction from the world than in 2014 when Russia invaded us and occupied Crimea. And right. I think that's because people just didn't know.
Yeah, I hear you on that. The world certainly knows now what's going on in Ukraine. Let me ask you about something that you wrote yesterday, that you tweeted yesterday about the U.S. sending more military aid to Ukraine. You mentioned that the Javelins and the NLAWs, these next-generation light anti-tank weapons, which are similar to Javelins, have helped a great deal. You wrote that you didn't understand before why they were necessary, and the government had been saying there will be no full-scale invasion. And then you wrote, only the U.S. kept saying the truth. Anti-tank missile systems made us strong. What is your sense now in terms of the aid that Ukraine is getting of how effective it's been and perhaps how much more is needed. It's a hot debate in terms of how involved the U.S. should be beyond giving aid. The president said yesterday that the U.S. is not putting troops on the ground in Ukraine at all. But in terms of what the U.S. is doing, how much is it helping?
U.S. is helping a lot, as well as the United Kingdom, for example. But still, javelins and NLAWs, they helped us a lot because Russia has many tanks. Russia is outnumbering us at all fronts, like human power, tanks, military machines, and these NLAWs and javelins, they helped us to stand against Russia, and they keep helping us. But now that there is a next stage of war, and now we need heavy weapons because we just don't need to protect our lands anymore. We need to take those lands back. Like, for example, the blockade Mariupol, which was mostly seized by Russia, except of the Azovstal territory. It's the steel factory where more than 2,000 people are currently sheltering underground, including civilians and remaining Ukrainian soldiers. And only heavy weapons can allow us to start liberating our territory seized by Russia in the first days of war. And this is, as Russia today said, now its goal is not only to occupy Ukrainian Donbass, but also to create the land corridor from Russia through Ukraine, south to Transnistria. So this means that Moldova might be next target. So if you don't give heavy weapons and enough heavy weapons to Ukraine now, war will go farther in Europe.
Veronika Melkozarova, executive editor of The New Voice of Ukraine. I appreciate you making time for us. Thank you very much. We will have more on Ukraine in just a moment, including a report on the next stage of this war. And later, windy weather and western wildfires. We will have the latest from Arizona. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Humanitarian aid workers are working on escape routes out of eastern Ukraine. They are planning to receive thousands of refugees from cities like Mariupol. Some survivors of the devastation there spoke to our partners at Sky News. Correspondent Mark Stone has their stories.
Under skies that present a constant threat, and into a car park where they've been expected for days. 3 buses from Mariupol. Through the last checkpoint and to a safety of sorts. 79 of the most vulnerable. They've been inside the besieged city for 8 weeks. Among them, Mikhailo and his wife Maria. In no state to talk. Witnesses to an awfulness that brings an old man to this. Nearby, father and son, Vladimir and Andrei Stevanov.
Situation is very bad. The destroy is everywhere. Радянський Союз повернувся у найпоганішому світі.
And as President Putin was declaring that the city was now in Russian control, a hint of what that looks like. Satellite imagery from just outside Mariupol, the 19th of March, the 26th of March, and the 3rd of April. 200 graves at a site which continues to expand. Inside the tent here in Zaporizhzhia, they are fed. These are people who have lived in bunkers for weeks. They have with them all that's left. How many people do you think are still, civilians are still in Mariupol?
50,000 people, mostly civilians.
50,000?
Yes, 50,000. Це недосягнута місія. Ми відкрили коридор для 1000 людей і очікували, що це буде принаймні 5000 людей. Зараз ми маємо 79 людей. Це те, що робить Росія.
Back outside and fed, Mikhailo thought he was ready to talk. Just tell me how the situation is in Mariupol at the moment.
Я не можу. Пробачте, я ужасно. Ужасно. Бачите, мужик гідний, я сльози. Там все розбито, все розбито. Все. Ну, все, пробачте. Сльози вже в діда сльози от, на очах. Трудилися, от, в 65 років все. І ніжчими стали. Ніжчими стали. Все. Ні квартири, нічого. Ну, переїхав от сюди, от видите. Тележка і все в мене. Більше нічого нема.
And the sirens are still going off.
І сирени, ви чуєте сирени, не припиняються.
Та, самоліти літають, на сирен нема, одні самоліти. Бомбять. І артилерія. Працює ужас. Там, туди тільки заїхати, подивитися, більше нічого не треба.
What now for Mikhailo? What now for everyone here? And everyone still there? Mark Stone, Sky News in Zaporizhia.
Still to come, we will have an update on the January 6th investigation, including developments with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's political future. When will we learn what the January 6th committee knows about the attack at the U.S. Capitol? According to one committee member, this summer. Congressman Jamie Raskin said as much during an event yesterday. According to Mr. Raskin, the committee will begin public hearings in June. Its findings would, in his words, blow the roof off the House, meaning the United States House. That might shed a bit more light on a New York Times report out today. It involves comments from House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, reportedly made in the days following the insurrection. These findings are part of a new book by the reporters behind the scoop, Alexander Burns and Jonathan Martin. It has to do with recordings of phone calls. In those tapes, Leader McCarthy told Congresswoman Liz Cheney that he thought former President Trump should consider resigning from office. In a statement, the congressman said, quote, "The New York Times reporting on me is totally false and wrong. It comes as no surprise that the corporate media is obsessed with doing everything it can to further a liberal agenda," unquote. Here is one part of the recordings as heard last night on MSNBC.
Are you hearing that he might resign? Is there any reason to think that might happen?
I've had some few discussions. My gut tells me no. I'm seriously thinking of having that conversation with him tonight. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to call him. This is what I think. No, it'll pass the House. I think there's a chance it'll pass the Senate even when he's gone. And I think there's a lot of different ramifications for that. Again, I mean, the only discussion I would have with him is that I think this will pass, and it would be my recommendation we should resign. I mean, that would be my take, but I don't think he would take it, but I don't know.
NBC News is awaiting comment from both Congressman McCarthy and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. In the meantime, let's get into the January 6th investigation with Nicholas Wu, a congressional reporter for Politico. Mr. Wu, good evening. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
First of all, just to clarify that clip for people who are watching, when he refers to it passing, what is he's referring to a vote to possibly impeach and remove the president. And it sounds like he's saying jump before you're pushed. Is that basically it?
That's exactly what Leader McCarthy is saying. This comes as House Democrats were starting to draw up articles of impeachment against Trump in the days after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And what McCarthy is basically saying is that the votes aren't there. And so Trump should just resign rather than have to deal with being impeached and then potentially convicted and removed from office by the Senate, a much higher threshold. And it speaks to the level of anger among lawmakers at Trump at the time.
How do these tapes potentially fit into the larger January 6th investigation?
These conversations are something that we've known about for some time, but the tapes add a lot of additional context and color to what was going on. The January 6th committee has actually alluded to these conversations in the past. In their letter inviting Leader McCarthy to come before the committee, they note how McCarthy's tone on Trump suddenly changed in the days after the attack, even after there had been talk among senior House Republicans about removing the president from office. And so, they wanted to figure out what exactly was going on between McCarthy and Trump, and whether, frankly, if Trump and his allies told Leader McCarthy what to say. They want to get to the bottom of what changed here. Why was there this about face from senior Republicans about the attack?
Let's put that in context with another clip of the audio that was released this morning. Here is Representative McCarthy talking about the former president's responsibilities on January 6th. Listen.
But let me be very clear to all of you, and I've been very clear to the president. He bears responsibilities for his words and actions. No ifs, ands, or buts. I asked him personally today, does he hold responsibility for what happened? Does he feel bad about what happened? He told me he does have some responsibility for what happened. And he needs to acknowledge that.
So how does this all put a new context, a new flavor on what we've heard from Leader McCarthy, particularly what he said when the insurrection happened?
This level of detail is relatively hard to find in a lot of political reporting. We get these kinds of calls read out to us all the time by people, but what makes this one special is that it's only a few senior Republicans and their staff potentially who were on this call, and it was recorded, which it directly refutes what McCarthy had said about this call. McCarthy said that the New York Times' reporting was false and untrue, and this recording clearly shows that's not the case. And so what all this boils down to is a credibility gap of sorts about what Leader McCarthy was saying in the days after the attack, and then what he told his caucus afterwards. He went from saying that Trump bore some responsibility for the attack and that he told him that he bore responsibility, from rejecting the January 6th committee's invitation to testify before them, siding against an independent commission to investigate the January 6th attack, and otherwise trying to defend the former president as this investigation has ramped up.
I have to admit, when I saw this story this morning, I was a little nonplussed by it. It kind of felt like politician lies to public, film at 11. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not a shock that he would say one thing publicly and then say another thing privately. But this might not be anything more than that, except that Kevin McCarthy has other political aspirations, including potentially being the House Speaker if the Democrats lose ground in the midterms.
Yes, this kind of talk has long been an issue among House Republicans, publicly saying one thing and, yes, privately saying other things about the former president. But as you noted, Leader McCarthy is someone who very much does want to become Speaker, assuming Republicans take the House this fall. And so if he wants to do that, he'll need to win enough support from Republicans to do so. And for this to come out now in a way that could really damage his credibility among hardline Trump-aligned Republicans, this could be a challenge for McCarthy's leadership.
Let me ask you about a few other details about January 6th before we go. We know that Donald Trump Jr. is getting set to meet with the committee. That is coming together. There's also talk that the committee wants to change a law called the Insurrection Act of 1807. What would that involve, changing a law that is 115 years old?
Well, the changes to the law are part and parcel of the kind of quieter track of what the committee is doing, which is to come up with legislative recommendations to prevent things like January 6th from happening again. The Insurrection Act conversation comes in the context of concerns Trump was going to mobilize federal troops to try to intervene in the 2020 election and to really go after these entirely debunked claims of voter fraud that he was looking at. And so the committee, among other legislative recommendations, is looking at that. They're looking at ways to make it harder to challenge election results. But the problem is, if Republicans are going to take the House and potentially the Senate this fall, the pathway for any of this kind of legislation to make it into law and signed by the president is very narrow.
And I just want to note, as soon as I said that, my inner editor told me it's 215 years old. So please do not send me angry tweets. Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Politico. Appreciate you putting this in context for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including an update on Florida stripping Disney World of its self-governing status, more on windy weather and Arizona's growing wildfires, plus a preview of this Sunday's presidential election in France. That's all just ahead. Stay close. An act of political retribution against Walt Disney World became official today. This afternoon, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a bill that will revoke Disney's unique self-governing status. It's how Walt Disney himself negotiated the resort's construction 55 years ago, treating the land kind of like its own county. The governor was clear about what caused this change: Disney's opposition to a bill that critics say will hurt LGBTQ children.
Did have the situation with our Parents' Rights and Education bill. For whatever reason, Disney got on that bandwagon. They demagogued the bill. They lied about it, whatever, came out against it. We signed the bill, and then, and incredibly, they say, we are going to work to repeal parents' rights in Florida. And I'm just thinking to myself, you're a corporation based in Burbank, California, and you're going to marshal your economic might to attack the parents of my state? We view that as a provocation, and we're going to fight back against that. But
the law targeting Disney will not take effect for about a year, and it's unclear whether the company will sue. The governor also signed a bill today banning critical race theory in Florida's public schools. To be clear, NBC News has no evidence that any public school anywhere in Florida has ever taught CRT. One of Europe's most powerful leaders is up for re-election this weekend. French President Emmanuel Macron is running against a far-right challenger, Marine Le Pen. Now, the outcome of this election could have a big impact on the war in Ukraine. Here's NBC senior international correspondent Keir Simmons.
Tonight's French President Emmanuel Macron, just 24 hours away from a critical election test. Can he hold off surging support for the flag-waving far-right's Marine Le Pen, who's zeroing in on people's economic struggles?
This is glorious.
She's a fan of President Trump and President Putin, a past campaign even funded by Russians. And she's openly hostile to NATO. Macron supporters we met today all had one word for her.
Very dangerous.
But Macron branded an establishment elitist by his opponent in their heated television debate. Students we watched with left disillusioned.
Raise your hand if you thought that Macron won that debate.
Polls say most French think he did win the debate and will win on Sunday. But the gap has been closing, and outside Paris, we found others ready to vote for anyone but Macron, and reluctant to admit it.
I think I'm going to vote for the other candidate because...
The other candidate, not Macron.
No.
But you don't want to say her name.
That's NBC's Keir Simmons reporting. Parts of the U.S. are dealing with wildfires that keep getting worse. Fires are burning across more than 30 miles in Arizona, fanned by relentless winds. Thousands of people are evacuating their homes. NBC's Miguel Almaguer has more on the evacuation and relief efforts.
Overmatched and understaffed, tonight firefighters across the West are on their heels. A series of destructive and fast-moving infernos devouring homes.
You could hear the fire coming. It was so intense.
Facing extreme conditions, the most dangerous fires today are whipped by winds. Here in Arizona, where dozens of structures have been obliterated, crews are struggling to stay ahead of the tunnel fire and are mopping up in its apocalyptic path.
The environment is not very friendly. It was blowing 70 miles an hour.
While today brought momentary relief in the form of hail and rain in Flagstaff, powerful and perhaps catastrophic gusts are still in the forecast across Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. 11 million people under red flag warnings. Some families desperate to see if their homes are still standing.
We could have a home to come back to, or we could not.
Many others are returning to what is now ash and rubble.
It just is really frightening to, think that just like that,
it's gone.
After an early and devastating start, this year's fire season is already approaching 1 million acres lost, nearly double the land during the same time period last year. Tonight, on this Earth Day, a troubling trend and now an ominous forecast on the horizon.
In these windy and cold conditions, the fire here in Flagstaff is finally moving away from homes, but crews know that could change on a dime. Back to you.
Thank you, Miguel. That's NBC's Miguel Almaguer reporting from Arizona. And wildfires are also on President Biden's agenda today. He signed an executive order to help save America's forests.
I think that we're in one of those moments in world history and in American history where we've reached the point that the crisis on the environment has become so obvious, with the notable exception of the former president, that we really have an opportunity to do things we couldn't have done 2, 5, 10 years ago.
The executive order focuses on fighting deforestation and boosting wildfire resilience. NBC's Mike Memoli has more on that.
You know, Joshua, one of the real frustrations when you talk to White House officials about the very difficult political environment facing Democrats in this midterm election year is the fact that they think Democrats have a very strong case to make to voters this year. As White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain recently put it to Chuck Todd, whether it's the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, the COVID relief law, or the $1 trillion infrastructure law, which the president has been talking about across the country this week, there's a lot in there that voters should be very happy with and reward Democrats for. But instead, what has most of the conversation been about? What Democrats have failed to deliver on? The Build Back Better legislation, climate, health care. That's interestingly what the president came here to Seattle to talk about. First, at an Earth Day event, talking about what has been in the infrastructure law that has helped to meet some of the climate goals that President Biden has delivered on, as well as talking about lowering the cost of prescription drugs later in the day at a community college. Now, the president was rather frank about why the Democrats have fallen short so far. He talked about the fact that there is, as he put it later this afternoon, one Democrat but 50 Republicans who have stood in the way of things like expanding the child tax credit. And so the president really, as we saw today, trying to focus less on the divisions within the Democratic Party and turn up the heat on Republicans. He actually seized on those new audio tapes from the Republican House leader, Kevin McCarthy, talking about President Trump to say this isn't your father's Republican Party, that this is now the MAGA Party, highlighting the fact that Donald Trump continues to have a real firm grip on the Republican Party. So we're seeing something of a pivot by the White House this week as they move closer to the midterm elections, trying to focus again away from the Democratic divisions and spotlight those Republicans. And this is important because, as Biden laid out, this is time in a midterm election year where, as he has often put it in the past, don't judge me against Almighty, judge me against the alternatives. So the White House increasingly trying to draw clearer contrasts with Republicans. The president also speaking to Democratic donors here, acknowledging, as he has said, that we are stymied by the fact that we have this situation in Ukraine, which is driving up inflation, the cost of gas, but also COVID, which is continuing to weigh on voters' minds. So this is a trip, the most extensive travel we've seen from the president in one calendar week this year, trying to get out of Washington, make the case directly to voters, while quietly they're trying to lay the groundwork for advancing some legislation in the remaining productive works of the congressional session. Congress back in town next week before the August recess to try to get it done. But as the president again laid out, one Democrat, maybe two, standing in the way, and that's why the president trying to build that outside pressure in. Joshua.
Thank you, Mike. That's NBC's Mike Memoli on a gorgeous day in Seattle. Now, scientists around the world are looking for climate solutions. One company aims to help the planet using concrete. Our special series, The Climate Challenge. Before we go. Am I the only one who finds Earth Day kind of depressing sometimes? With everything happening to our climate, hope can be really hard to come by. But that is why NBC News is exploring solutions in our special series, The Climate Challenge. One big focus is capturing and storing carbon dioxide. And one solution might involve one of the least green materials on Earth, concrete. In a moment, we'll hear from a group that is encouraging the search for solutions. But first, let's get the story from NBC's Josh Letterman.
Go forward a little bit more.
Concrete.
the world's most ubiquitous building material, so central to modern life that the U.S. makes 2 tons of it per year for every man, woman, and child. It's how we build our homes, our roads, our pipes. But making it is also a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, fueling global warming. But what if concrete could instead be a climate solution? A place to store carbon dioxide and keep it out of the atmosphere.
The concept of storing CO2 in concrete has actually been around for decades. What CarbonCure was able to innovate is find a way to implement it easily and without disrupting operations while improving the performance of concrete.
Founded in 2012, CarbonCure is one of the leading manufacturers of carbon removal and utilization technologies, with other companies like Boston Metals and Climatework also in the field. In the past, most carbon storage solutions focused on storing CO2 either underground or in trees. A lot of people don't realize, but heavy industry actually makes up about 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And so while a lot of progress has been made on transportation with electric vehicles and reducing carbon from electricity with renewable sources like wind and solar, there is still a lot of work to do to get the technologies needed to reduce our carbon footprint from heavy industrial processes like making concrete. Concrete plants using CarbonCure's technology inject CO2 directly into the concrete, making it look like black, dry ice. According to a Princeton study, around 8% of overall global emissions come solely from the making of cement, a key ingredient in concrete. Climate scientists say humans have already pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere that we now have to find ways to remove what's already been released and store it safely.
Everybody wants to build green, but what we've found is that not very many of them are willing to pay more for it. So because of that, we've had to develop technology which is cost neutral. So this allows the concrete producer to be able to provide the same quality concrete with a lower carbon footprint at about the same price.
So how does it end up being the same price if they have to pay more to add this to it?
When you add CO2 into concrete, there's a chemical reaction which occurs, which actually increases the strength and performance of that concrete. The concrete producer then is able to benefit from that improved performance by using a little bit less cement in their concrete. This allows them to offset the cost of purchasing the CO2 and the technology.
Last year, the company won a $20 million X Prize for carbon utilization, for capturing CO2 and using it in an innovative way.
It created a sort of a global visibility for our technology and what we were able to do.
The X Prize organization hosts competitions to help solve some of the world's biggest environmental issues. This year, CarbonCure is in the running for the Elon Musk-backed Carbon Removal X Prize. The competition spans 4 years, with $80 million in awards going to winners by 2025. The company will likely use the prize money to implement their technology at other concrete sites, like this one owned by Cheney Enterprises in Waldorf, Maryland, that already uses CarbonCure. CarbonCure, an early example of how environmentally friendly concrete now seems more possible than ever. Do you foresee a time when every concrete plant in the U.S. is injecting and storing CO2?
If it helps lower your carbon footprint, gain some efficiencies, and it just makes a better product, I don't know why you wouldn't.
That was NBC's Josh Letterman reporting. Let's continue now with Marcus Extavor, the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Climate and Environment for X Prize. Mr. Extavor, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Can you just give us the basic layman's explanation about why CO2 matters in terms of addressing climate change and improving the environment? What's the role of that?
Yeah, absolutely. You might have heard the phrase global warming. The Earth is warmed by the sun every day, and it sheds a certain amount of that heat back into space. When we add more CO2 into the atmosphere, it blocks the heat from leaving, and that causes not just the warming of the Earth, but also other changes in climate. That's why CO2 is important.
So CarbonCure is a past winner of the X Prize. X Prize runs a number of different competitions based on climate solutions. The new round of 15 winners was announced today. Tell me about some of the winners and what stood out about them to you.
Certainly. Well, the competition that we launched a year ago, and we're just coming to the end of this first year, is about something we call carbon removal. The most important thing we have to do with our climate change and our carbon dioxide problem is stop emitting carbon dioxide. It's pretty straightforward. The challenge is actually getting on with doing it. But there's another thing that we have to do, which is we have to actively take out some of the carbon dioxide we've already put up there. It's a little bit like waste disposal. First, you have to stop throwing garbage in the street, but you also still have to clean up the garbage pile. Now, there are a handful of ways you can do this. Plants know how to eat up CO2, take it out of the air. Plants in the ocean, plants on land, all sorts of different technologies that are mechanical, use mine tailings, use rocks, use agricultural solutions. There are many ways to do it. What we're trying to encourage is taking the ideas and turning them into action.
Explain how the X Prize works from when you put out a challenge to when you award the prize money. What's the process?
Sure. The basic process is, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to encourage smart and creative and passionate solution developers. They could be entrepreneurs, they could be business people, they could be scientists, they could be artists. It doesn't matter. We want to encourage them to go after solutions that matter for all of humanity. So we pick a problem like climate change and carbon removal. We structure a set of rules, almost like a game, and then we say, if you can hit these technology targets, you win. And in this case, winning means not just attention, credibility, but it also means cash. We have a cash reward system, so we pay for success. We're coming to the first end of the first round of this competition, and we are just about to award these 15 milestone prize winners.
Forgive me for interrupting. I think your feed froze for just a split second. I thought you were done. Sorry about that. But with regard to the prize and the competition, I imagine there's like a verification process and they have to kind of replicate what they did. They can't just say, I have a Green Lantern ring that takes carbon out of the atmosphere. Like, you have to go there, watch them do it, make sure that they can do what they say they can do, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not an ideas competition. It starts with an idea. This is a prove it competition. So we're just coming to the end of the round where teams had to show not just their idea, but the progress they had made to date. And it's not a popularity contest either. We have a team of over 70 scientists from around the world that screen them for the scientific credibility. And then we have another separate pool of judges that go deep into things like the business plan, the cost analysis, and all the technical details to understand which are the most promising teams and technologies that should be awarded at this middle stage of the competition.
So like I said, Earth Day is a very important, observance around the world. I grew up in Florida with a very, very serious respect for the environment kind of drummed into me from a very young age. Environmental stories and environmental initiatives feel pretty depressing, especially with some of the recent reports that have come out from climate scientists, from the UN, saying basically we've got like 45 minutes to save the world. It just doesn't feel very optimistic or even doable at times. How do you feel about the prospects for us to actually do what needs to be done to save the world, literally to save the world?
I know what you mean. I feel that every day. I mean, look at the idea of time running out on a really hard problem that you're not exactly sure how to solve is not a good feeling. It's not a very motivating feeling. So I think two things. On the one hand, I want to sort of stare that reality in the face and try to just swallow the hard facts that, yep, we should have done more sooner and we haven't, and we got to deal with that. I think the thing that keeps me going is that, guess what? As much as we're searching for new innovative solutions, we already have a bunch of great solutions we know we can deploy today to reduce our emissions. I'm talking in transportation, I'm talking in food, I'm talking in the way we plan our cities. That doesn't have to hurt. It doesn't have to really interrupt our lifestyles too much. So I think I'm optimistic that we actually can get on with those. I think it's important to stare the reality in the face. But, I didn't really grow up as an environmentalist. I sort of came to it later as an engineer and a scientist. And I'm pretty motivated the idea that, it's hard, but we actually can do this and maybe even achieve a better society on the other side. It's not just about making something bad less bad. It's actually about making it better.
I hear you on that. And you reminded me of that quote from James Baldwin, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. Before I let you go, what is the one thing you would like to see more of us do to reduce carbon in the atmosphere? I imagine the big solutions come from intergovernmental efforts and so on, but is there anything that just little old me can do that's actually going to matter?
It's a great question. I'm going to use a big phrase. It's a collective action problem. If you and I do our part, we actually need everyone to do our part. So I encourage people to do what they can in their own lives, not because the small things we can do are going to add up to enough, but because they create awareness. So to finally answer your question, by creating an awareness in our mind that this is an issue, that allows us to band together. It means reaching out to our local representatives, no matter where we live. It means thinking about ways we can take action in our jobs, in our families, in our communities. It's a collective action problem, which means by working together, we actually can get ourselves out of this mess and get to a better place.
Marcus X. DeVore of X Prize, appreciate you being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And with that, your weekend can begin. Be sure to join us Wednesday for part 2 of our series on equity in the cannabis industry. You'll meet people in California and Massachusetts who benefited from efforts to bring equity to this business. That is on Wednesday, but we welcome your stories about how the push for pot legalization has affected you. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622, or email nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you Monday. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.